Hi, everybody. I'm going to introduce Dr. Kurtz now. And I'm going to repeat everything I just said for those that are joining us virtually. Dr. William Kurtz was the former managing director and digital historian at the John L. Mao III Center for Civil War History at UVA. He received his PhD in history at UVA in 2012. He's published 2 books and many articles related to the American Civil War. He's a past employee of Virginia Humanities. He is a veteran of a number of digital history projects, including Black Virginians in Blue, UVA Unionists, Founders Online, and the People of the Founding Era. So we are very excited to have him here today, and we are very excited to hear his talk today, Black Virginians in Blue, the Untold Stories of Albemarle County's U.S. Colored Troops. Dr. Kurtz.
Perfect. Okay. It looks like we're all set. So I'll begin. So thank you everybody for being here today. Thank you for Susie for inviting me to give this Ivy talk. I've participated in so many events at Ivy Creek. It's nice to give back in my small way. It's been about 2 years since I left my position at the Now Center. So undoubtedly there are some new things that have been discovered about what I'm going to tell you today, but I'll tell you where to find them after we're done. So basically, let me start off with saying that African-American soldiers and sailors played vital roles in the Union victory in the American Civil War, fought from 1861 to 1865. Played vital roles in Union victory and, of course, in the final end of slavery in the United States. As part of my work at the Now Center for Civil War History at the University of Virginia, I worked with a team of historians on the project that I'm going to tell you about today to uncover the unknown history of local African Americans who served in the Union military during the war. And this talk I'm going to give to you today is about a actual website that you can go and learn even more called Black Virginians in Blue. And it tells those stories in a number of important ways. So first of all, why were these stories unknown? Well, I mean, anybody familiar with African-American history knows how neglected it's been in academia before basically the civil rights movement. But what about here in Charlottesville, Virginia? Well, you would be forgiven for not knowing that there was any Black Civil War story or history here in Charlottesville, Virginia, because, and this is weird because these things used to actually exist, now they're gone. The story of the Civil War was completely about the Confederacy. Nothing about the Union, nothing about local African Americans, all about the Confederacy. That's how historians wrote about the conflict. That's how people remembered the conflict in these specific ways that you can see on this slide. In the Stonewall Jackson statue that was downtown, in the mail order, no, I'm serious, you have your choice of which Confederate soldier you wanted to put in your nondescript, setting. This mail order Confederate soldier who was out in front of the Albemarle County courthouse for a long time, was just recently removed in the last couple of years. And then even at UVA, what you're looking at is one of 2 plaques that honored the roughly 500 UVA students who died during the Civil War, who served in the Confederacy. Again, in the Confederacy, it's everything that's been remembered here is the Confederacy. And I haven't even gotten to, the most important symbol of the Confederacy that used to exist in Charlottesville, which is the Robert E. Lee Memorial. In 1924, that statue was dedicated, and it was basically the triumph of what we call the lost cause version of the Civil War. The lost cause version of the Civil War, which celebrated Southern rights, downplayed the importance of slavery during the war. This is the crowning achievement of that effort to construct a pro-Confederate history of our city and county in Charlottesville. It didn't matter that Lee never fought a battle here. He wasn't from here. Same thing with Jackson. Those are the two great heroes. So Charlottesville is putting itself on the map by bringing in this larger Virginia Confederate history and trying to claim it as their own. So the question is there more to the story? And so that's what I began to research back in 2016 at the Now Center. Brief diversion from the main point of our talk today, which is to talk about UVA Unionists. So one thing that we discovered very quickly was that there were a lot of UVA students and professors or former professors who sided with the Union cause. About 60, and actually the number's gone up significantly thanks to Brian Newman, who's my wonderful replacement at the Now Center. But at the time that I was there, about 60 students served in the Union Army, Navy, or government during the Civil War. And we're not just talking about, nobody knows about them privates. We're talking about people who were generals, okay? These are very important people who had an impact on the Civil War. Like these two gentlemen here, the gentleman on the with the wonderful mustache, that's Ray Wirt Davis, and the other gentleman with the goatee is Charles Ewing. Charles Ewing was the brother-in-law of William Tecumseh Sherman, the second best general in the Union Army after Ulysses S. Grant, and a general in his own right. And you didn't hear anything about them. Why not? Well, when UVA went to write its history of the Civil War, which was written down in the early 20th century by a historian named Philip Alexander Bruce, wrote a 5-volume history of the University of Virginia to that point, basically the centennial history. He had a bunch of chapters about Confederates from UVA, but he didn't have anything about anyone who was on the other side of the conflict. And I need not tell you that he had nothing about local African Americans in his history. Just completely erase those two groups from the landscape. So this is like the smaller project. This project became UVA Unionists, which is also a website that you can check out later if you're interested. But what I'm here to tell you about today is an even more important story, an even more underexplored and underappreciated story. At least people knew about Ray Wirt Davis and Charles Ewing someplace, right? Charles Ewing's known in Ohio, okay? So he has some appreciation somewhere. But these stories of local African Americans who fought in the Civil War is completely unknown, anywhere, not to mention here, nobody really knew anything about them. So what we did was we set about correcting this story in order to tell a local history of the Civil War that was not just about the Confederacy, but that was more inclusive, that talked about the entire population of Albemarle County during the Civil War. A lot of people don't know that, in fact, the majority of Albemarle County in 1860 was enslaved. 13,000 people who lived in Charlottesville or Albemarle County were enslaved African Americans. 12,000 were white. So the majority of the population is enslaved. And then there were about 600 free African Americans as well. Okay. And sorry, let's go back to that slide real quick. This is the depiction of the famous Battle of Fort Wagner, which if you've ever seen the wonderful Civil War movie Glory, that's what this painting is dedicated to, that battle in 1863. Okay, but before I tell you about the local story, let's talk about the national story. Let's put this in a larger context, because this is something that hopefully people learned a little bit about in high school or in their reading of history. So initially, Black enlistment was very controversial everywhere across the United States. North, well, in the South, it wasn't happening, but in the North, it was very controversial. The federal government refused to enlist Black soldiers in 1861 and 1862, the first 2 years of the war. However, what happened is that everybody thought, 1 month war or 3 month war ended up lasting for years and ended up costing tens of thousands of casualties. So they began to realize that you can't defeat the South unless you defeat slavery. You need to take advantage of this large group of people, about 4 million African Americans in the South, mostly enslaved, who want their freedom and who will help the Union win this war if you give them the chance. So famously, General Benjamin Butler started using soldiers right here in Virginia out at Fort Monroe as, quote, contraband laborers. So they became, that was like the first official military use of African Americans to help the Union cause. And then on September 22nd, 1862, Abraham Lincoln decided to give the initial Emancipation Proclamation, promising that slaves in the still rebellious South would be free at the new year if the Confederacy didn't basically give up. So at this point in the war, late 1862, there had been a couple of local efforts to enlist Black soldiers. It wasn't officially approved on the national level, but it was very local, and it was in the South. It was in the South Carolina Sea Islands, which had been occupied by Union soldiers early in the war, and it was in New Orleans, which was occupied in early 1862, because Union soldiers were there. African Americans had the opportunity to enlist in those specific places. But on January 1st, 1863, Lincoln actually made the Emancipation Proclamation more radical. He said, we're going to start enlisting Black soldiers to fight and to help save the Union and thereby end slavery. By the war's end, 179,000 Black men served in segregated regiments in what was known as the United States Colored Troops, or USCT for short. About 5,700 Virginia Black men enlisted within units that were raised in the state of Virginia. That's a misleading number. I'll tell you about it in just a second, with 4 of those soldiers winning the Medal of Honor. Now, let's talk about the Navy briefly. The Navy actually had a tradition of African-American men serving on board naval vessels before the Civil War. It wasn't like there wasn't recruitment drives specifically trying to get African-American sailors or African-Americans with naval experience or sailing experience, but they had served. And so the barriers of overcoming getting African-Americans into the Navy were less intense. And so they started serving with the official, basically the official okay of the Secretary of the Navy in late 1861. By the end of the war, about 18,000 Black men served in the Union Navy during the Civil War, of whom about 2,800 were born in Virginia. So you're already thinking, why is like more than 1/10 of our Black Union sailors from Virginia, but a tiny percentages from Virginia in the Army? I'll get to that in just a moment. So how did we find these men who served in the war? Well, there are very few traces of them here. We don't, like I said, there's no monuments, there's no history books, there's nothing about local African Americans serving in the Civil War. And a partial reason for this is that African Americans served in the USCT, which were federal units, not state units, meaning that all of the records about them are up in Washington. So you got to go up to Washington to find them. With that being said, there's been a tremendous outpouring of digitization of historical resources, especially in African American history, thanks to the National Archives in Washington. So you actually can do a lot of like genealogical research on African American soldiers and sailors online on websites like the National Parks website, on fold3.com, on ancestry.com. These are websites that a lot of people probably know about from genealogical research, on newspaper databases as well. And what those records come back with are some, or what those websites come back with, or point you to at least, are some really important sources. Number one, service records. The Union government compiled service data on all of its soldiers after the war. And you can actually say, well, my relative is, well, Hugh Carr didn't serve, but let's just say Hugh Carr. My relative was Hugh Carr. Let me see his file. And they can pull that file for you and show it to you. This file is for a man named Jesse Coles, who actually settled in Pennsylvania after the war. And it gives some information about their service as well. Here is Reverend Cole's pension record. Pension records are the record of veterans trying to get some monetary assistance to support them in their old age and their disease or injuries that they sustained during the war. And they become fascinating genealogical resources. I had no idea as a Civil War historian how good and how rich these were, but basically what it enabled us to do was to create a project that is not just a military history, but it's a social history, and it's a cultural history, and it's a history of African Americans from our county, which would not have been possible with just plain old military records. The pension records established who they married, how many children they had, where do they live, where do they move around, what did they do after the war, what happened to them during the war, what kind of aid did they need from the federal government. And the last thing, and this is very unusual because a lot of our 250 soldiers and 6 sailors, they, were average people, and they didn't rise to prominence necessarily always rise to prominence in their community, and weren't like Reverend Cole, who was a leader, who got his own obituary in a local newspaper. But obituaries were very important resources for us as well. Okay, so by the time we released our findings in 2021, we had located 250 soldiers, as I already said, and they served in 80 different regiments in the Civil War. So they're not all in just one regiment from Virginia. They're all over the place. They really have, studying these people allows you to study the actual history of the larger Black experience in the Civil War, because they were from everywhere. They served in both the Western and Eastern theaters from 1862 to 1867, when the last Black regiments were finally discharged 2 years after the war. None of them served at the Battle of Fort Wagner. I'm sorry, you won't find them in the movie Glory. Although one man did join the 54th Massachusetts Regiment after the battle had finished. But they did serve at some of the most important battles that determined Union victory in the Civil War, including Port Hudson, the Siege of Petersburg, Virginia, Newmarket Heights, Nashville, Tennessee, Fort Fisher, Honey Hill, Natural Bridge, Florida, not in Virginia, and the Appomattox campaign, which saw the final defeat of Robert E. Lee. In addition, 6 sailors served during the war, and where did they serve? Well, they served on the Atlantic on blockade duty, making sure that the Confederates couldn't get arms from Europe, and they also served on various ships that patrolled the Mississippi and other western rivers during the Civil War. Now, the 2 men pictured here, the man dressed as a soldier, this is the only image we have of one of our local Black men dressed as a soldier. This is Willis Calhoun, and the other gentleman later in life is George Washington Lewis of the 127th USCT. He had actually been manumitted before the war and lived in Pennsylvania right before the war, and died there as well. He was involved in that Appomattox campaign that saw the final defeat of the Confederacy. Now, Willis Calhoun, unfortunately, was not as lucky. He died during the war of typhus. And as his story demonstrates, I like to think that this, I want to celebrate what these men did and the fact that, we need to tell people about their stories and about what they did. But there's also a tragic element of this. These men did not all go on to have wonderful lives after the war, because, it's a war, and they suffered tremendous casualties as a result of their experiences in the Civil War. 72 of the 250 men died in the Civil War, which is a death rate of 28%. 28% of every African-American man who was born in Albemarle County or Charlottesville, 28% of them died during the Civil War. To put that in context, 18% of African Americans overall died in the conflict, which is a staggering number on its own. About 15% of white Union soldiers died during the conflict. And as you can see from this chart, only 5 of them died from battle wounds, and only 1 died from an accident. The vast majority of them died from disease. Disease was a terrible, terrible killer that disproportionately affected Black soldiers in the Civil War. Some of the leading causes, as you can see right here, were diarrhea, pneumonia, and smallpox. It was a, they didn't take this decision to enlist lightly. They put their lives on the line for the Union and to end slavery. Now you're going to ask me, okay, well, Albemarle County was occupied by the Confederacy. There was a huge, Confederate military hospital here. There were military soldiers patrolling Albemarle. How did these men get to the Union Army to serve? Well, this is the interesting part. In fact, only 14 of these men enlisted right here in the state of Virginia, with the rest joining from 20 other different states. You can see this color-coded map here with the darker states showing those which contributed more men during the Civil War. In short, what our study represents is it represents the reality of antebellum Black life. It shows that people who were born in Virginia didn't necessarily stay in Virginia. In fact, a lot of enslaved people were sold out of Virginia to states in the West. So that's what you're seeing right there with Missouri. We have whole families being relocated. When their white families decided there wasn't enough land in Charlottesville and Albemarle anymore, where did they go? Well, first they went to Kentucky. Kentucky got too crowded. So then they went to Missouri, and they took hundreds and hundreds of people, Black people born here with them, who obviously had no say in leaving. And then another thing that led to a lot of African Americans, you can see the state of Ohio, a free state, 25 men born here enlisted in Ohio. Why is that? Because Virginia state law discriminated against free Blacks. It basically encouraged them to leave. They did not want them here. They saw them as a threat to slavery. And so one of the most popular places they went to was to Ohio, where there was a thriving Black community, many of them from Virginia before the Civil War. So why do I think this finding is important? Well, first, I think, we need to look sometimes beyond what happens just within the county when you're talking about local history. These people had no choice in being forced to leave the state, but they're from here. They're a part of our story. And so in telling their story, we're recognizing, the impact of racism and slavery on the local African American community and how it dispersed them across the United States. And another thing I think is important to note is that I told you that historians say, well, there's only about 6,000 Black men from Virginia who served. Well, Virginia was the largest slave-holding state before the Civil War. And so if you don't just look at people who enlisted here, but you look at Black Virginians who have been forced out of the state, there's probably thousands and thousands and thousands of stories that we don't know about Black Virginians from the Civil War. So let me tell you about 4 of the most exemplary stories I've discovered so far. Okay, so the first I'm going to tell you about is a sailor, Alexander King. He was the very first Black man born in Albemarle County to serve in the Union cause in the Civil War. I don't know anything about his early life. I don't know how he got to Philadelphia. I just know that he was born in Charlottesville and he was living as a barber, working as a barber in Philadelphia when the war broke out. And he enlisted in January 1862, basically within months of African Americans being allowed to join. He earned $12 a month as a landsman. And he served an entire year before 1863, January 1863, when Black men would be welcomed into the Union Army. He served on board that ship, which is on the top there, the USS St. Louis. He was hunting commerce raiders off the coast of Africa. And although I can't prove it, and there's no record of them intercepting slave traders, of course, his ship acting off the coast of Africa would have impeded any remaining slave trading going on out of Africa at the time as well. The Union and Great Britain actually signed a treaty saying that they would jointly patrol the African coast, West African coast, to make sure that the slave trade was stopped. So he went from there to serving in blockade duty off the coast of South Carolina at the end of the war. And he was discharged from the Navy in February 1865, having completed his 3-year tour of duty. But he's unique. So he actually decided he wanted a second go at the Navy. I mean, there's only one other Albemarle man that I know of, Richard M. Cox, who decided he would serve in the Army again, in the famous Buffalo Soldiers. People may have heard of the Buffalo Soldiers, black regiments served in the U.S. Army after the Civil War. He decided to serve again, and he served on board, this time a brand new, spanking new ship, sorry, technical term, the USS Franklin, that ship down there, which was carrying on board it no less than Admiral David M. Farragut, the great Civil War hero of the Battle of Mobile Bay of 1864. And what he was involved in was a goodwill tour. So the U.S. Navy decided to do this goodwill tour of all the ports of the Mediterranean and the Baltics and all across Europe, mending relations after the Civil War. And so I honestly believe that Alexander King was the best traveled black man from Virginia in the 19th century. I mean, he saw it all while he was in the Navy. And when he died in 1915 in Philadelphia, his funeral made public notice. The local Republican club held a gathering for him, and he was buried at the Soldiers and Sailors Cemetery, National Cemetery in Philadelphia. Now, the second story I'm going to tell you about is that of Peter Churchwell. And Peter Churchwell was born, we think, in Albemarle around 1829, but was sold to another owner named Reuben Gordon, Madison County, before the war. Being in Madison County, he decided that he would risk it. He would be one of those people who would brave all of those Confederate soldiers between him and Washington to escape to freedom in DC, which is exactly what he did. And he ended up enlisting in the 23rd USAT Regiment on July 13th, 1864. July 13th, 1864. I don't know if we have any people who've served here before, but when you enlist in the Army, usually there's a lengthy process of training and acclimating before you're launched into battle. But that was not the case for Churchwell. He was actually in his very first battle, the Battle of the Crater, which is depicted here outside of Petersburg, Virginia, less than 3 weeks later, on July 30th, 1864. Battle of the Crater was a horrific battle in which Union soldiers got trapped inside of a giant crater that had been blown up in order to break through Confederate lines. The soldiers were supposed to go around the crater, but unfortunately the white units that were leading the charge, this is a whole nother talk, went into the crater. So everybody followed them in there. And as soon as the Confederates saw that, they basically lined up along the crater and just started shooting people, and especially black people. So he was actually lucky. He was only shot in the head. He actually survived the Battle of the Crater. For just a few days after the Battle of the Crater, he was put to work by his Confederate captors burying the dead from that battle. I mean, can you imagine with a grievous wound like that and doing this? And officially, nobody knew what happened to him. So the Army thought he was dead. So his daughter actually got his pension. His pension was applied for by his mother and on behalf of her granddaughter, and she got it. But so if you only look at the military records, you'd be like, okay, that's the end of poor Peter Churchwell. But fortunately, we had the pension. And we were able to find out that after being captured, he was actually resold to his former master. He was listed in the papers in Richmond and resold to the master, who basically, didn't want him anymore. So sold him several times down into Raleigh, North Carolina, where he eventually escaped when Union forces swept through North Carolina in 1865. He later remarried and moved up to Washington, D.C., where he worked as a shoemaker and received his pension to support him in his old age. Peter died on January 14th, 1902, and he is buried with thousands of other Union heroes of the Civil War at Arlington National Cemetery. So for many of these people, like Peter, like they served as laborers. These black men went back to work as farmhands. They weren't making a lot of money after the war. Many of them never learned to read, or of course they were never taught to read in slavery. But there are some stories that people were able to become very, very prominent in their local community. And that's the story I'll tell you right now of William Johnson. So at the age of 97, William Johnson actually told his story to a member of a New Deal program called the Work Progress Administration. And they took down testimonies of people who had survived slavery to preserve those oral testimonies before those people passed away. 1930, not many people left in the 1930s to give those interviews. And his story is a really fascinating one. He was born in Albemarle on February 14th, 1840. And as a young boy, he worked in a number of places around Virginia, including his owner, Nancy Johnson's estate in Goochland County. Now, when the Civil War broke out, all the white men in the family went off to serve in the Confederate Army. So he was basically in charge of the farm along with his mistress during the war. Until one day, his, quote, William, my own young master, took Johnson with him to serve as his body servant during the Civil War in 1863. But in July 1864, something happened. The unit that they were serving in, that his Confederate master was serving in, captured some Union soldiers. And these Union soldiers were left unattended with Johnson. And they told him, you know what this war is about, right? This is about freedom. You should get out of here. You don't need to be serving in the Confederate Army against your will as a slave. So what he did with a bunch of his friends is he snuck off shortly thereafter, got to Union lines, became part of Benjamin Butler's Army of the James, and served as a quartermaster, basically, in the Army in an unofficial role. So he's not part of the U.S. colored troops. He's still serving with the Army, keeping the rations in readiness, as he said to his interviewer. Now, after the war, Johnson survives the war. After the war, he returned to Goochland, reunited with his family, and he eventually moves to Richmond, where he becomes a wealthy, he first starts out in the bricklaying trade. He moves up and becomes a contractor. He has his own contracting company. This is Mr. Johnson right here on the bottom right. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier, with his wife, Hannah, seated across from him with their children, with their 5 children. After a long, successful career as a contractor, he retired in 1932. 1932, when he was in his 90s, because he lost his leg to infection. That was the only thing that was keeping Mr. Johnson back. He was a prominent member of his community. He belonged to the Masons, Oddfellows, Good Samaritans, etc. He sent a bunch of his children and his grandchildren to college. The person who interviewed him described him as, quote, an affluent retired building contractor who, despite his 97 years of adventure in life, faces the future with strength, vigor, and alert mind and a modern outlook on life. Johnson died the following year and is buried in East End Cemetery in Richmond. His wife, Hannah, who passed away a few years earlier, is buried beside him. Okay, am I still doing okay on time? Okay. She told me I had to extend it, so I extended it. Okay, what Susie did. So the last story is probably the most important one for us here locally. All of the men I mentioned earlier did not return to their birthplace after the Civil War. They went to where they had been living before the Civil War, except for this man, James T.S. Taylor, who is the most prominent of all of our subjects. That's James T.S. Taylor right there, seated with his wife, Eliza, sometime after the Civil War. And I'll explain that letter in just a second. Okay. So he was actually not born here. but he lived here for almost the entirety of his life. His father had purchased his family's freedom, and they moved to Charlottesville in the 1850s. But in 1862, the Confederates had begun impressing slaves and free Black men into the army to serve as laborers. And so James decided he would run away from Charlottesville and go to Washington, D.C. It's one of the few stories that we know of successfully doing that. And he served in the 2nd USCT Infantry Regiment starting in August of 1863. So James served in Florida for most of the war. And during the war, he was the commissary sergeant. So he was a non-commissioned officer. Most African Americans were privates or non-commissioned officers because of the prevailing racism that said that they had to be led by white officers, commissioned officers. So this is about, and he actually speaks to this point in just a second. And so there's a discrepancy in some of the rations or whatever, a misunderstanding on his commanding officer's part. So he's actually placed in arrest. And so what he does is he writes to Abraham Lincoln himself and says, you know, I enlisted in Washington, D.C., so you're the person I need to appeal to help me. And he wrote, I cannot have no better source to apply for aid than to ask a favor from your hands. So he's eventually released. He serves out his term faithfully for the rest of his time in the Union Army. He also wrote a series of letters to a prominent African-American newspaper called the Anglo-African. And these letters were published during the Civil War, which are published on our project website if you're interested. And so one of these letters, he actually says, like, look, this is ridiculous. Why can't we serve as officers? We've proved that we're worthy of serving as officers, not just like white men. We can do just as good a job as they can. And so he says, are we still to be deprived of all those rights and privileges which by our sacrifices we justly merit? This nation had to be taught some very severe lessons by Providence before they would even let the Negro have a musket. And now, not until equal rights are given us as soldiers, will the God of all wisdom lead the nation to a victorious triumph and a lasting peace. At the close of the war, he meets his wife, Eliza Delancey, in Key West, and they move back to Charlottesville. He serves in the state constitutional convention for Virginia, which rewrites the state's constitution in 1867, in which he is an early supporter of the secret ballot, the paper ballot. You want to get away from having a public voice ballot because guess what? Former masters will know how you're voted and they can take retribution on you. So this is an important reform for African-American rights and allows them to vote the way they want to without retribution. The idea gained support and it was enshrined in the state constitution in 1870. He tried twice unsuccessfully to be a member of the Virginia House of Delegates, but he campaigned on behalf of pretty much every Republican presidential candidate for the rest of the 19th century. He was very prominent in local Black politics. He died of pneumonia on January 4th, 1918, and he's buried at Oakwood Cemetery right here in Charlottesville. He received a front page obituary in the Daily Progress, which is unusual to say the least, which praised him as, quote, a faithful and respected citizen of this city. And now his widow actually outlived him into the 1930s, and she too actually gave a WPA narrative history too. It's really fascinating. So this leads me into the idea of pensions. I've talked about pensions before. Both James and Eliza received federal pensions as a result of James's service during the Civil War. Overall, at least 133 pensions were filed on behalf of Albemarle-born Black Civil War veterans or their family members. And these pensions were a crucial source of income. Remember I said most African Americans are serving in unskilled labor positions after the Civil War, including these veterans. And so that, you know, $8, $12, $20 a month is big and important for you to support your family. And the interesting thing is that African-American men from Albemarle were very, very successful in getting those pensions. One study by a man named Donald Schaefer found that about 92% of white Union veterans got a pension if they applied for it. Well, 93%, almost 94% of African Americans from Albemarle County got it, compared to only 75% of African Americans overall. So the widows, you can see if you go down the chart, the widows and children were also more successful than most Black applicants as well. And I think this points to the fact that, like I told you about the horrific casualties, disease, and everything. I mean, these men really sacrificed. And so they had a claim on the government. And even if their pension should have been so much more, they at least had some federal recognition of what they had done to help them and their families in their declining years. So in conclusion, I hope, telling these stories of people like Alexander Kane, Peter Churchwell, William Isaac Johnson, and James T.S. Taylor, goes to show you that there's a bigger story of the Civil War here. I haven't even touched on, African Americans who lived here during the Civil War. There's a bigger story here that we can tell about our county if we use the military as the hook to get into these individual lives. And we tell this larger story of African American history by doing local history. So the Civil War is so much more than those monuments that used to be here. There's so much more than those histories that only talked about the Confederacy. There were hundreds of African Americans from right here, thousands across the state, who served in the Union Army and Navy to defeat slavery and to save the United States from dismemberment. And I hope you appreciate learning more about their stories and their incredible bravery and their incredible sacrifice. You can find a summary of our findings in an article I published with the Albemarle County Historical Magazine right here, or better yet, go to the website. So thank you all very much. Okay, I'm not done. You thought I was done, but I'm not. So Hugh Carr did not serve. Question is, were there any members of the Carr family who served? I found no members of the Greer family, but of the Carr family, yes. There were 4 soldiers, but they all enlisted from those states in parentheses. So they all enlisted outside of the state. I don't know necessarily why they had moved out of the state. I don't know the exact details of when and where and why, but I'm hoping that some people might recognize some of these names, and maybe there's a broader conversation to be had there about tying in the local Carr family to the larger Carr family that's been dispersed as a result of slavery and the Civil War. So thank you very much.
So we have a question in the chat box there, and then anyone here can also ask questions if they would.
Okay. Yeah. So the question I got in the chat was, did African American women serve important roles? Yes, they served in the Union Army as they would have been like doing the wash or as servants or as laborers. They would have been supporting support. They would have been in supportive roles in camps where African American men were enlisting into the Union Army. Just by running away from the Confederacy, they're providing a vital service, which is depriving the South of slave labor. Excuse me. And without that labor, that's going to help break down the Southern economy that's sustaining that military conflict. So they're serving as nurses as well. I don't have any stories of local Black women in the Civil War to tell you much about in that context, but in the course of researching these men, we learned about their wives, and it was very important for me that we tried to write a biography, birth to death history of every single soldier and sailor and all of their spouses. And so we've found things about African American women while their men were away at the front. Their slave owning families in Missouri would take retribution on them and basically kick them off the plantation and let them fend for themselves. And so that's why they, in some cases, end up working in the Union Army is because they have to take care of their kids, and they've lost their source of support, or they've lost their way of life that they had been living. So there's a lot of fascinating stories, and the women, I should say, play a crucial role in getting these pensions because African Americans in slavery did not have official birth certificates or official marriage certificates. How are you going to prove that this is your wife? I was married to this soldier. How are you going to prove, like when the children were born? You have your neighbors, you have your friends, you have your brothers and sisters, you have your relatives. And so what we see is the Black community from Albemarle, men and women dispersed across the country, all working together to get those people who need those military pensions to get them. And that's, I think, is one of the reasons why they're so successful in getting those pensions, because the community was so strong. One woman named Nancy Red, I refer to her as the local historian of her. She is the historian of her family in Missouri, and she knows everybody. She's testifying in every pension. She backs up every story. Without her, the thing falls apart. She's just one of the many women who are playing this role of taking care of the veterans and their families, spouses or relatives or friends after the war. Okay, let's see. Nursing, yeah, serving as nurses during the Civil War. Yeah, I think I covered that. Sorry, Dee Dee, but yeah, absolutely. Most nurses, female nurses in the start of the Civil War would have been white women, but that would have changed as African Americans were welcomed into participation in the Civil War as well. So one thing I'll say about the website without showing you, because you can look at it yourself, is that we wanted to make it as useful as possible. We wanted to tell all the research we found and share it so that the local community could appreciate it, learn more about it. I've had descendants of the Taylor family come to me, and I've been able to give them all of the records I found about James T.S. and enrich their genealogical work. And they've come to me and they've given me so much more than I've given to them, local Black community. Having that website there tells people that this is a story that people care about. And so my 5 years at the Now Center, people from Ohio and Pennsylvania and from Charlottesville were just coming up and saying, I know about this, or here's a picture of, let's go back. Well, that picture I had of William Isaac Johnson, hey, that's, my great grandfather, or the picture of James T.S. Taylor, that's from a local descendant as well. So they've been enriching that story, helping the Now Center to tell a better story. And it was really important to me to not just try to tell their story, but to let them tell their story. So whenever I found a letter or a testimony, telling a life story in a pension document or anything, anything in their voice from the men or the women, I published it on our website so people could use it and appreciate it and use it to enrich their own research into African American history. In addition to providing lots of contextual essays written by wonderful UVA students, writing lesson plans for Virginia state teachers for middle school and high school, just trying to make something that appealed to everyone and that could be as useful as possible to everyone interested in African American history and Civil War, etc.
All right, thank you. That was really great. And thank you all that came today and joined us for this very important history. For those of you that are with us virtually, we hope that if you have not visited Ivy Creek Natural Area and Historic Riverview Farm, that you will do so soon. We have a Riverview Farm tour planned for September 30th, and that is free and open to the public, and you can come and join us and learn more about the Card-Greer family, their work in the community, and the legacies that they left behind. Our next Ivy Talk is going to be on October 18th from 6:30 to 8 p.m. It will be the second Virginia Breeding Bird Atlas, a bird conservation tool for the 21st century. This talk will be virtual, not in person. And you can sign up for that one like you did for this one. And we have one more really awesome program that's coming up at the end of October. It will take place on October 28th, and it is Farm Day. It will be from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., and we will have local African American and Indigenous farmers. We will have local farming organizations. It will focus on the history of farming, the future of farming, and we'll have activities for families and kids and adults. And Tilly will be milking. So lots of fun. That's our cow for those of you all that don't know. So it'll be a great day, and it's free and open to the public, and we hope everyone will come and join us then. So thank you all for coming today, and have a great rest of your day.